Hi everyone, welcome to week 5. This week we'll be discussing Stanger's chapters 7, 8, and 9. And in this week's reading, she discusses a story of two thieves that characterizes a relation between science with a capital S and the state. So in these chapters, she's unpacking scientific rationalities that yield to the facts and how these rationalities fuel economies of knowledge that sustain capitalism. So Stengers discusses a sort of staging that creates the truths it seeks to maintain by means of its very methods. So she's suggesting that a desire for evidence and proof is a manifestation of an attachment to capitalist progress and mentalities that continually fulfill themselves by measuring everything against a preconceived backdrop and criteria for evaluation. So these categories, she says, produce an amnesia to that which isn't already known. Everything becomes situated within this predetermined linear trajectory of progress, and that determines what counts and what is valued. And I think a quote to help us think more about this is something written by Frantz Fanon. He writes, sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong, and when they're presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. They will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with that core belief. So Stengers argues that under the cover of modernization, the act and art of paying attention to the other becomes pacified. She goes on to say very explicitly on page 77, we're swamped with consensual narratives in which what has succeeded in counting and presented as normal, in which struggle is passed over in silence. So she provokes us to question how expertise is produced and under what terms. So how it restrains a capacity and a taste for paying attention to things other than what's already defined and what's measurable. So she argues that this reliance on expertise separates, codifies, and encloses knowledge and decision-making into the privileged space of the elite, outside of the realm of public opinion and of discourse. So she also argues that cognitive capitalism destroys communal thought, or the sort of collective attention to other narratives that might produce new modes of resistance. So she offers the example of computer programmers who operate in a commons, a communal immaterial space that is ungoverned by industry, where programmers are able to resist enclosures and defend alternative narratives that allow them to think and cooperatively act with and in ambiguity that doesn't need to be removed. So around this specific situation, this group comes together to forge heterogeneous responses to a common concern. And Stengers is very adamant that this ambiguity not be removed for the sake of efficiency or to resolve difficulty, but rather hold on to this ambiguity so that this collective can contribute to a common concern without defining it. So next week, we'll discuss further the dangers or poisons, as Stengers calls them, of falling back into old habits of mind despite a desire to cultivate change. So toward the end of our reading this week, Stengers highlights a difference between common concerns that forge responses based on heterogeneity and public activism or advocacy. So she writes on page 94 that people might take to the streets, but perhaps to prevent this act from becoming again a poison, we must transform what a street is. And this is a powerful part of this chapter, I think, because she's arguing that we need to undo the very structures in which we think and operate, an undoing that might become possible with small gestures that are able to maintain an otherwise. They're not seeking a grand narrative to fall back into similar habits. So feminist anthropologist Anna Singh calls this the serious work of noticing. Singh writes in detail about the art of noticing as a way of attuning to small moments that may fall outside of dominant regimes of progress and common thought, to the minute detail of things when seen in relation, and how these little details in noticing, these nuances of something, might enliven an imagination towards seeing something as otherwise, unfamiliar, and something possible outside of grand narratives that we already hold. So in this week's portfolio entry, you'll be taking up the act or art of noticing as an opportunity to pause and consider the processes and orientations of paying attention and considering what this does to how you see something that's familiar to you already. So you'll be paying attention to something in particular rather than something in general. You'll be attending to the singularity or the embodiment of the uniqueness of something, taking a nuanced, particular, descriptive, and evocative rendering of whatever the object is that you're inquiring with. And you'll be considering how you can attend to the specificity of this object or artifact that you're noticing. So in paying attention, we aim to stretch and really pull apart at the composition of what makes a thing a thing. So beyond a generalized assumption or cliche. And with this said, it's very easy to fall back into descriptions that repeat what we already know about something. And this is something to be careful with in your portfolio entries. Try to represent something in a way that provokes attention to the unfamiliar. Be disruptive. And think in ways that maybe fall outside your common habits of thought. And as Stengers writes, create an event that opens up a new field of questions and possibilities. So in this entry, try to hold a nuanced attention to the ways in which something holds dimension. How is this object different? Explore its contours and intimacies in a way that doesn't only show the bright or positive or the commonplace attractiveness of something, but in a way that demonstrates complexity. How the contrasts and contradictions of something is what gives it depth. So this is what is meant by nuance, that we're trying to move with multiple dimensions of something, not only really positive or really negative, but situating your thinking in between those binaries and trying to create a nuance in ways which elucidates a complexity beyond the surface level. And this requires an intricate attention and a slowness, I think, in order to hover long enough to notice and sustain this kind of intimacy. So in this way, this is not a fast entry, this is a slow work. So begin to think this week about how you might cultivate this kind of depth in your portfolio entries, considering what creates nuance, what creates depth in my writing and in this week in your photography practices. So this week's entry will be an exercise in paying attention and enacting the art of noticing through a lens. So the purpose of this week's exercise is to cultivate an attention to the life of a common object that you often use or see in your daily life, and begin to pay attention to the stories and memories of this object as an artifact whose life and meaning is dependent on its relations with others. And I'm going to share a piece of writing that I think offers an example of this.